Welcome tonight. We are going to talk about the Apache. In the vast expanse of the American Southwest, where the desert sun beats down on rugged mountains and endless plains, stretched toward distant horizons, there once roamed a people whose very name struck both fear and admiration into the hearts of those who encountered them. The Apache were not a single unified nation, but rather a collection of related groups, bound by language, culture, and an indomitable spirit that would become legendary. Their story is one of adaptation, survival, resistance, and ultimately resilience in the face of overwhelming change. To understand the Apache is to understand the land itself, a harsh, unforgiving environment that demanded strength, cunning, and an intimate knowledge of every canyon, water source, and mountain pass. The Apache made this challenging landscape their home, their fortress, and their teacher. They developed a way of life so perfectly adapted to the Southwest that they became, in many ways, inseparable from it. Their history spans centuries of freedom, decades of conflict, and generations of persistence, leaving an indelible mark on the story of North America. The name Apache itself comes not from the people who bore it, but from their enemies. The word likely derives from the Zuni word Apache, meaning enemy, though some scholars trace it to the Yavapai word for people. The Apache themselves use different names for their various groups, ND, or Dine, all meaning simply the people. This multiplicity of names reflects the diverse nature of Apache culture. For while they shared common linguistic and cultural roots, the Apache were divided into numerous bands and groups, each with their own territories, leaders, and traditions. The Apache belong to the Athabascan language family, making them linguistic relatives of peoples as far north as Alaska and Western Canada. This connection suggests that the ancestors of the Apache migrated southward from the subarctic regions of North America, though the exact timing and route of this migration remains subjects of scholarly debate. Archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests that the Apache arrived in the Southwest sometime between 1000 and 1500 CE, though some researchers place the migration even earlier. When the Apache arrived in the Southwest, they entered a land already inhabited by Pueblo-dwelling peoples, desert farmers, and other indigenous groups. Rather than displacing these populations entirely, the Apache often existed alongside them, sometimes trading, sometimes raiding, adapting their own culture to the opportunities and challenges of their new homeland. The Apache were not farmers by tradition, though some groups practiced limited agriculture. Instead, they were hunters and gatherers, supplementing their diet through trade and, when necessary, raids on their neighbors. The Apache homeland, at its greatest extent, covered a vast territory spanning what is now Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Texas, and northern Mexico. This was not a unified kingdom or nation-state in the European sense, but rather a network of autonomous bands, each controlling its own territory while maintaining loose connections to other Apache groups. The landscape itself shaped Apache culture and military tactics. The mountains provided refuge and vantage points, the deserts offered concealment and testing grounds for endurance, and the scattered water sources became strategic locations worth fighting to control. Apache society was organized around the extended family and the local group, typically consisting of several related families. These local groups, in turn, were part of larger bands, and bands were associated with one of the major Apache divisions. Leadership was earned rather than inherited, with men and women who demonstrated wisdom, courage, or special skills gaining influence within their communities. Chiefs led by consensus and example rather than decree, and their authority depended on the continued support of their followers. The major Apache groups included the Western Apache, Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Lipan, and Plains Apache, also known as Kiowa Apache. Each of these divisions had its own territory and cultural characteristics, though they shared fundamental aspects of Apache culture. The Western Apache lived in what is now east-central Arizona. The Chiricahua ranged across southeastern Arizona, southwestern New Mexico, and northern Mexico. The Mescalero occupied south-central New Mexico. The Jicarilla lived in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. The Lipan resided in Texas and northern Mexico. And the Plains Apache lived on the southern Great Plains. The Western Apache were particularly diverse, consisting of 5 major groups: the White Mountain Apache, Cibecue Apache, San Carlos Apache, Northern Tonto Apache, and Southern Tonto Apache. These groups occupied the mountains, valleys, and plateaus of Arizona, living in wickiups, dome-shaped structures made from wooden poles covered with brush or hide. They hunted deer, elk, and smaller game, gathered wild plants, and practiced limited farming in areas where water was available. The Western Apache were known for their basketry, creating intricately woven baskets that served both practical and ceremonial purposes. The Chiricahua Apache, perhaps the most famous of all Apache groups due to leaders like Cochise and Geronimo, were divided into 3 bands: the Chihenne, Warm Springs or Ojo Caliente Apache, the Choconen, Central Chiricahua, and the Nedni, Southern Chiricahua. The Chiricahua ranged across a vast territory of mountains and deserts, moving seasonally to take advantage of different food sources and following the game herds. They were renowned as warriors and raiders, striking fear into Spanish, Mexican, and later American settlements with their speed, tactical brilliance, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The Mescalero Apache derived their name from their extensive use of mescal, a plant that provided both food and fiber. They roasted the hearts of mescal plants in underground pits, creating a nutritious food that could be stored for long periods. The Mescalero territory centered on the Sacramento and Guadalupe Mountains of New Mexico, a land of dramatic peaks and hidden valleys that provided both sustenance and security. Like other Apache groups, the Mescalero combined hunting, gathering, and raiding to survive in their challenging environment. The Jicarilla Apache lived in the mountains and plateaus of northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, a region that bridged the Southwest and the Great Plains. This geographic position influenced Jicarilla culture, which incorporated elements of both the Southwestern Apache tradition and the Plains Indian lifestyle. The Jicarilla hunted buffalo on the eastern plains and elk in the mountains, gathered plants throughout their territory, and developed a rich, ceremonial tradition that reflected their unique cultural position. The Lipan Apache occupied the southern plains of Texas and ranged into northern Mexico. They were expert buffalo hunters and maintained the nomadic lifestyle characteristic of plains tribes, though they also retained many southwestern Apache cultural traits. The Lipan were among the first Apache groups to acquire horses from the Spanish, which transformed their way of life and military capabilities. With horses, the Apache became even more mobile and formidable, able to cover vast distances, carry more goods, and execute raids with devastating speed. Apache daily life revolved around the rhythm of the seasons and the availability of food. In spring, many groups gathered wild plants, the tender shoots of yucca, the buds of various cacti, and numerous other edible plants that the desert provided to those who knew where to look. Summer brought the ripening of fruits and seeds, as well as the opportunity to hunt game that had grown fat on the season's abundance. Fall was a time of intensive food gathering and preparation for winter, with families processing meat, storing plant foods, and ensuring they had adequate supplies for the lean months ahead. Winter was a time of relative stability, with families sheltering in protected canyons or mountain locations, living on stored foods and hunting when weather permitted. The Apache were masters of desert and mountain survival, possessing knowledge that had been accumulated and refined over generations. They knew which plants were edible, which had medicinal properties, and which could be used for tools or shelter. They could read the landscape like a book, seeing signs that others would miss. The slight disturbance of stones that indicated someone had passed this way. The behavior of animals that suggested water was near. The patterns of weather in the clouds and wind. This knowledge was not academic but practical, passed down through stories, example, and experience essential for survival in an environment that offered both abundance and peril. Water was perhaps the most precious resource in the Apache homeland. The ability to find, remember, and defend water sources was critical to survival. Apache bands knew every spring, every seep, every place where water collected after rains. This knowledge was strategic as well as practical. Controlling water sources meant controlling the land, and denying water to enemies could be as effective as defeating them in battle. The Apache defended their water sources fiercely and could survive with remarkably little water, knowing how to find moisture in plants, how to travel in the cool of night to reduce water needs, and how to move efficiently across waterless stretches of desert. Apache children began learning survival skills almost from birth. Boys learned to hunt, track, and fight, developing endurance through rigorous training that included long runs, tests of strength, and practice with weapons. Girls learned to gather plants, prepare food, make clothing and shelter, and all the other skills necessary to maintain a household. Both boys and girls learned the stories of their people, the prayers and ceremonies that maintained harmony with the spiritual world, and the values that defined what it meant to be Apache: courage, generosity, respect for family, and loyalty to one's group. The coming-of-age ceremony for Apache girls, known as the Sunrise Dance, or Naiwis among the Western Apache, was and remains one of the most important ceremonies in Apache culture. This 4-day ceremony marks a girl's transition to womanhood and is believed to imbue her with the power of changing woman, one of the most important figures in Apache mythology. The ceremony involves elaborate rituals, dancing, singing, and the participation of the entire community. It demonstrates the central role of women in Apache society and the importance of maintaining cultural traditions across generations. Apache religious beliefs centered on a complex understanding of spiritual power, natural forces, and the relationship between humans and the world around them. They believed in a creator deity, often called Usan or the life-giver, and in numerous spiritual beings associated with natural phenomena, animals and places. The Apache world was alive with spiritual significance, where mountains, springs, and certain animals held sacred power. Ceremonies and prayers helped maintain balance and harmony with these spiritual forces. Shamans, both male and female, played important roles in Apache communities. These individuals were believed to possess special spiritual power that allowed them to heal the sick, conduct ceremonies, and communicate with the spiritual world. Becoming a shaman often involved a vision or spiritual calling, followed by training with an experienced practitioner. Shamans used a combination of herbal remedies, prayers, songs, and ceremonies to address both physical and spiritual ailments. The Apache understanding of medicine was holistic, recognizing that physical health, spiritual well-being, and social harmony were interconnected. Despite their spiritual richness and cultural sophistication, the Apache are often remembered primarily as warriors. This emphasis, while containing truth, tells an incomplete story. The Apache were indeed formidable fighters, but warfare was a means to an end, survival and protection of their way of life, not the defining characteristic of their culture. Nevertheless, Apache military prowess deserves examination, for it shaped both their history and how they are remembered. Apache warfare was characterized by speed, surprise, and tactical brilliance. Rather than engaging in pitched battles when possible to avoid, Apache warriors preferred raids and ambushes, striking quickly and disappearing into terrain they knew intimately. A typical Apache raiding party might consist of anywhere from a handful to several dozen warriors traveling light and moving fast. They could cover astonishing distances on foot or horseback, enduring harsh conditions that would break less hardened fighters. When pursued, they used every trick the land afforded: false trails, doubled-back routes, travel over rocky ground that left no tracks, and when necessary, splitting up to confuse followers. Apache warriors trained from childhood for the physical demands of warfare. Young men underwent rigorous tests of endurance, including runs carrying water in their mouths that they could not swallow until they returned, runs with mouthfuls of seeds that had to remain whole, and long journeys with minimal food and water. This training developed the extraordinary stamina that Apache warriors were famous for: the ability to run for hours or days, to go without water longer than their enemies believed possible, to function effectively under conditions that would incapacitate others. Weapons evolved as the Apache adapted to new opportunities and challenges. Traditional weapons included the bow and arrow, clubs, and lances. The Apache bow was typically short, made from mulberry or other flexible wood, and powerful despite its size. Arrows were crafted with stone and later metal points, fletched with feathers, and capable of deadly accuracy in skilled hands. Warriors also carried rawhide shields that could deflect arrows and even bullets if the angle was right. With the arrival of Europeans, the Apache quickly incorporated new weapons: metal knives, firearms, and metal-tipped arrows that were more durable and effective than stone points. The Apache relationship with the horse transformed their military capabilities and way of life. Horses came to the southwest with the Spanish, and the Apache acquired them through raids and trade beginning in the late 1600s. While never as horse-centered as the Plains tribes, the Apache became skilled riders, using horses to increase their mobility, carry supplies, and execute raids over vast distances. A mounted Apache raiding party could strike far from their home territory and return before their enemies could organize an effective response. But Apache warfare was not simply about physical prowess and tactical skill. It was also psychological. The Apache understood that the fear they inspired was a weapon as potent as any bow or rifle. By striking unexpectedly, leaving few witnesses, and seeming to appear and disappear at will, they created an aura of invincibility that worked to their advantage. Spanish, Mexican, and American forces often overestimated Apache numbers because a small band of warriors could create the impression of a much larger force through speed and strategic attacks. The first sustained contact between the Apache and Europeans came with the Spanish colonization of the Southwest, beginning in earnest in the late 1500s and early 1600s. The Spanish brought horses, metal tools and weapons, new diseases, and a dramatically different worldview based on territorial conquest, religious conversion, and economic exploitation. The collision of Spanish and Apache cultures set patterns that would define relations between the Apache and European-descended peoples for centuries. Initial Spanish accounts of the Apache describe them as fierce warriors and skilled hunters who raided Spanish settlements and allied native peoples for horses, metal goods, and other resources. The Spanish, for their part, attempted to control the Apache through a combination of military force, missionary activity, and alliance with other indigenous groups. These efforts met with limited success. The Apache proved difficult to subjugate or convert, maintaining their independence and continuing their traditional way of life despite Spanish pressure. The Spanish established presidios, military outposts, throughout the northern frontier of New Spain, partly to defend against Apache raids. Towns and missions suffered repeated attacks, with the Apache striking quickly to take horses, cattle, and goods before fading back into the mountains and deserts. The Spanish response typically involved punitive expeditions, which sometimes succeeded in recovering stolen property or punishing specific Apache groups, but rarely achieved lasting control over Apache territory or behavior. One Spanish strategy involved attempting to settle the Apache in permanent communities where they could be controlled and converted to Christianity. These efforts almost invariably failed. The Apache, accustomed to mobility and independence, found sedentary life intolerable. Even those who initially accepted settlement would often leave when circumstances allowed, returning to their traditional territory and lifestyle. The fundamental incompatibility between Spanish colonial objectives and Apache cultural values made peaceful coexistence difficult. The situation changed somewhat in the 1780s when Spanish authorities, recognizing that military force alone could not defeat the Apache, adopted a new approach. They began establishing peace camps where Apache groups that agreed to cease raiding would receive rations, tools, and other goods. Some Apache groups accepted these terms, at least temporarily, seeing advantages in trade and the cessation of constant warfare. However, these arrangements were fragile, dependent on the continued flow of Spanish supplies, and vulnerable to the actions of Apache groups that chose to continue raiding. When Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821, the new nation inherited the conflict with the Apache. Mexican authorities continued and in some ways intensified the Spanish approach, launching military campaigns against the Apache and offering bounties for Apache scalps. This scalp bounty policy was particularly brutal, encouraging freelance scalp hunters who sometimes killed peaceful Apache and even other indigenous peoples, claiming the scalps were Apache to collect the reward. The policy created a cycle of violence and revenge that deepened Apache-Mexican hostilities. The Chiricahua Apache, living along the border between Mexico and what would become the United States, bore the brunt of Mexican military pressure. Mexican forces, sometimes in large expeditions and sometimes in smaller but more frequent patrols, attacked Apache camps, attempting to kill warriors and capture women and children. The Apache, for their part, raided Mexican settlements with increasing frequency and severity, taking livestock, supplies, and sometimes captives. This state of near-constant warfare defined Apache-Mexican relations throughout the Mexican period. In the 1830s and 1840s, a Chiricahua leader named Mangus Coloradas began to emerge as one of the most important Apache figures of the 19th century. Mangus Coloradas, whose name means red sleeves in Spanish, was a man of great physical stature and commanding presence. He led his people through increasingly difficult times, navigating relations with both Mexicans and the Americans who were beginning to enter Apache territory. Mangus Coloradas sought initially to maintain peace with the Americans, seeing them as potential allies against the Mexicans who had been his people's enemies for generations. The arrival of Americans in the Southwest came in several waves. First came fur trappers and traders in the 1820s and 1830s, moving through Apache territory in small numbers. These early American visitors often had relatively peaceful relations with the Apache, trading for information, guides, and supplies. The Apache, for their part, were curious about these newcomers and willing to engage in commerce when it proved mutually beneficial. The situation changed dramatically with the Mexican-American War of 1846-1848. American military forces marched through Apache territory, and the subsequent Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo transferred vast stretches of the Southwest, including much of the Apache homeland, from Mexican to American sovereignty. The Apache, of course, were not consulted about this transfer of their territory between two foreign powers. From the Apache perspective, the land belonged to them by virtue of long occupation and use, not to any European or European-descended nation, by virtue of lines drawn on maps. Initially, some Apache leaders saw the American conquest as potentially beneficial. The Americans were enemies of the Mexicans, and the Apache reasoned that they might find common cause with this new power. Mangus Coloradas and other leaders met with American military officers, and in some cases, agreements were reached that seemed to promise peaceful coexistence. The Apache would be allowed to continue their traditional way of life. Raids into Mexico would be tolerated, and the Americans would pass through Apache territory without interference. These early promises, whether made in good faith or not, proved impossible to keep. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 brought a flood of American prospectors and settlers through Apache territory. The California gold rush created trails across the Southwest, and these trails brought not dozens or hundreds of Americans, but thousands, then tens of thousands. These travelers needed water, game, and grazing for their animals, putting immediate pressure on the resources the Apache depended upon. Even more disruptive was the discovery of gold and other minerals in Apache territory itself. In the 1850s and 1860s, prospectors began entering the mountains of Arizona and New Mexico, staking claims and establishing mining camps. Unlike the California-bound travelers who passed through Apache lands, these miners intended to stay. They built permanent structures, diverted water, hunted game, and generally disrupted the Apache way of life. The Apache, understandably, viewed these intrusions as violations of their territory and threats to their survival. Conflicts began, as they often did, with misunderstandings, theft, and small-scale violence that escalated into larger confrontations. A stolen horse might lead to a revenge attack, which would lead to a punitive expedition, which would lead to a raid, and so the cycle continued. But there were also more egregious incidents that destroyed whatever trust might have existed between the Apache and the Americans. One such incident involved Mangus Coloradas himself. In 1860 or 1861, Mangus Coloradas visited a mining camp, likely to discuss peace or trade. The miners, rather than negotiating, tied him to a tree and whipped him severely. For a leader of Mangus Coloradas's stature to be treated in such a humiliating and brutal manner was an unforgivable insult. The incident transformed Mangus Coloradas from a potential peacemaker into an implacable enemy of American expansion. His response was to unite various Apache bands and allied groups in resistance to American encroachment. This was the beginning of what history would call the Apache Wars, though in truth there were multiple conflicts fought by different Apache groups at different times, rather than a single unified war. These conflicts would span more than 3 decades, from the early 1860s to the final surrender of Geronimo in 1886, and would become one of the longest and most difficult campaigns in American military history. The outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861 initially reduced American military presence in the Southwest as troops were withdrawn to fight in the East. The Apache took advantage of this opportunity, raiding with relative impunity and reoccupying areas that American forces had previously controlled. During this period, Mangus Coloradas worked to build a confederation of Apache groups and allied tribes. His son-in-law, Cochise, leader of the Choconen band of Chiricahua Apache, became a key partner in this resistance. Cochise deserves particular attention, for his life story encapsulates much of the tragedy and heroism of the Apache struggle. Born around 1810, Cochise was a warrior of renowned skill and a leader of great wisdom. Like Mangus Coloradas, Cochise initially sought accommodation with the Americans. he had allowed the Butterfield Overland Mail to establish a station in Apache Pass, a critical passage through the mountains of southeastern Arizona, and had maintained peaceful relations with the station employees. This fragile peace shattered in February 1861 in what became known as the Bascom Affair. A young U.S. Army lieutenant named George Bascom, investigating a raid that had actually been conducted by a different Apache group, accused Cochise of involvement and attempted to take him hostage. Cochise escaped, but several of his relatives were held by Bascom. Cochise responded by taking hostages of his own, hoping to negotiate an exchange. The situation deteriorated rapidly, with Cochise executing his hostages after Bascom hanged Cochise's relatives. The Bascom Affair transformed Cochise into an enemy of the United States. For the next 11 years, from 1861 to 1872, Cochise led a campaign of resistance that made travel through southeastern Arizona extremely dangerous. Working sometimes independently and sometimes in cooperation with other Apache leaders like Mangus Coloradus, Cochise and his warriors attacked wagon trains, military patrols, mining camps, and settlements. The Apache made Apache Pass so hazardous that the Army established Fort Bowie to protect the vital route. In January 1863, Mangus Coloradus, by then an old man by Apache standards, agreed to meet with American officials at Fort McLean in New Mexico. The circumstances of this meeting remain disputed, but what followed is clear. Mangus Coloradus was captured, held prisoner, and killed that night under suspicious circumstances. The official story claimed he was shot while trying to escape, but evidence suggests he was murdered, possibly tortured first. His death marked the end of one era of Apache resistance and the beginning of another. The killing of Mangus Coloradus had consequences that American officials likely did not anticipate. Rather than discouraging Apache resistance, it intensified it. The message received by the Apache was clear. American promises of safe conduct could not be trusted, and even the most prominent leaders were not safe when dealing with American authorities. Cochise and other leaders continued their resistance with renewed determination. The years following the Civil War brought increased American military pressure on the Apache. The Army, no longer occupied with internecine conflict, could devote more resources to subduing the Apache. Forts were established throughout Apache territory, and military campaigns became more frequent and systematic. The Army's strategy involved pursuing Apache bands relentlessly, destroying their camps, food supplies, and possessions, and making their traditional way of life untenable. General George Crook, who arrived in Arizona in 1871, brought a new approach to fighting the Apache. Crook recognized that conventional military tactics were ineffective against Apache warriors on their home ground. Instead, he organized units of Apache scouts, men from various Apache groups who were willing to work with the Americans, sometimes because of intertribal conflicts, sometimes because they saw no other path to survival. These scouts, led by American officers, could track and fight the hostile Apache in ways that regular Army units could not. The use of Apache scouts proved devastatingly effective. The scouts knew the terrain, understood Apache tactics, and could interpret signs that non-Apache soldiers would miss. They could travel as lightly and move as quickly as the warriors they pursued. Many of the most significant military victories over hostile Apache bands were achieved primarily by Apache scouts, with regular Army soldiers playing supporting roles. This use of Apache against Apache was controversial then and remains so in Apache oral history, with some viewing the scouts as traitors, while others see them as pragmatists trying to protect their own families in impossible circumstances. In 1872, Cochise finally agreed to peace negotiations, conducted through the intermediary of Thomas Jeffords, one of the few white men Cochise trusted. Jeffords had earned Cochise's respect through personal bravery and straightforward dealing. With Jeffords's help, General Oliver O. Howard negotiated a peace agreement that allowed Cochise and his people to remain in their traditional territory in southeastern Arizona. The Chiricahua Reservation was established, and for the last few years of his life, Cochise lived in relative peace. He died in 1874, probably from natural causes, leaving behind a legacy that would inspire Apache resistance for years to come. Cochise's son, Taza, attempted to maintain his father's peace, but circumstances worked against him. The Chiricahua Reservation was reduced in size, then eliminated entirely in 1876, with the Chiricahua being forced to relocate to the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona. San Carlos, located in a hot, malaria-ridden river valley, was despised by the Apache who were forced to live there. Multiple Apache groups from different bands, some traditional enemies, were concentrated in one location under the supervision of often corrupt or incompetent Indian agents. Food rations were inadequate, farming was difficult in the poor soil, and the restrictions on movement were intolerable to people accustomed to ranging freely across vast territories. The misery of San Carlos drove many Apache to escape and return to their traditional territories or flee into Mexico's Sierra Madre Mountains, where Mexican and American authorities found it extremely difficult to pursue them. These breakouts from San Carlos would become a recurring pattern, with various groups fleeing the reservation, being pursued by American and sometimes Mexican forces, and eventually either being killed, captured, or agreeing to return to the reservation, only to flee again when conditions became intolerable. Among those who refused to accept reservation life was a Chiricahua Apache named Geronimo. Born around 1829, Geronimo, whose Apache name was Goya Awe, meaning one who yawns, had experienced profound personal tragedy that shaped his destiny. In the 1850s, Mexican soldiers attacked his camp while he and other warriors were away trading. They killed his mother, wife, and 3 children. This massacre transformed Geronimo into an implacable enemy of Mexicans and later Americans who he saw as impediments to Apache freedom. Geronimo was never a chief in the traditional sense. He led through the force of his personality, his spiritual power, and his prowess as a warrior. He was believed to have special powers, including the ability to see the future, move without creating tracks, and protect his followers from bullets. Whether these powers were real or not mattered less than the fact that Geronimo and many others believed in them, and this belief gave him authority and his followers confidence. Between 1876 and 1886, Geronimo led or participated in multiple breakouts from the reservation, conducting raids in Arizona, New Mexico, and Mexico, before eventually being pursued back to San Carlos or agreeing to temporary surrenders. These campaigns involved relatively small numbers of warriors, sometimes fewer than 20, but created disproportionate fear and required massive military resources to combat. At the height of the final campaign against Geronimo, roughly 1/4 of the entire United States Army was involved in pursuing him and his band, along with thousands of Mexican soldiers and numerous Apache scouts. The tactics used by Geronimo's band were classic Apache warfare, perfected to its highest level. They traveled light and fast, rarely staying in one place for long. They used their knowledge of water sources to survive in terrain where their pursuers struggled. They laid false trails, split up to confuse followers, and when cornered, fought with desperate courage. Women and children accompanied the warriors, making the band's movements even more remarkable. They were not just a war party, but families seeking to maintain their traditional life against overwhelming opposition. The human cost of these campaigns was high on all sides. Apache raids killed settlers, miners, and soldiers. American and Mexican military operations killed Apache warriors, women, and children. Entire Apache families spent years on the run, living in constant fear, without stable homes or adequate food. Children grew up knowing only warfare and flight. The violence and disruption affected everyone involved, creating cycles of revenge and counter-revenge that made peace increasingly difficult. General Crook returned to Arizona in 1882 to lead the campaign against the Apache. Crook, again, employed Apache scouts extensively and pursued Geronimo's band into Mexico's Sierra Madre Mountains, a stronghold that had long been considered impenetrable. Crook's forces, guided by scouts, located Geronimo's camp and forced negotiations. In May 1883, Geronimo agreed to return to the reservation, but the peace was temporary. In May 1885, Geronimo broke out again, along with about 140 followers, including women and children. This would be the final campaign. General Crook pursued relentlessly, but after months of cat and mouse across the southwest and northern Mexico, Crook was replaced by General Nelson Miles, who brought even more resources to bear. Miles employed over 5,000 troops, established a heliograph communication system to coordinate movements, and used Apache scouts, including some of Geronimo's own relatives, to track the fugitives. The end came through a combination of military pressure and negotiation. Geronimo's band was reduced through desertions and casualties to about 30 people. They were exhausted, running out of options and facing pursuit from both American and Mexican forces. In September 1886, Geronimo finally surrendered to General Miles at Skeleton Canyon in Arizona. It was the last significant act of Apache armed resistance to American authority. The surrender terms that Geronimo accepted were soon violated. Miles had promised that Geronimo and his followers would be reunited with their families after a brief imprisonment, then allowed to return to Arizona. Instead, Geronimo, his warriors, their families, and even the Apache scouts who had helped track them down were all sent as prisoners of war to Florida, far from their homeland. They were held at Fort Pickens and Fort Marion in Florida, where the unfamiliar climate and diseases killed many, including children who had been sent to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. This betrayal of the Apache scouts who had served the U.S. Army faithfully was particularly bitter. Men who had risked their lives tracking hostile Apache, who had helped the Army win its campaign against Geronimo, were rewarded by being imprisoned alongside those they had fought. This act of betrayal resonated throughout Apache communities and stands as one of the darker chapters in the long history of broken promises to native peoples. From Florida, the Apache prisoners were eventually moved to Alabama, and then, in 1894, to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Geronimo would never see Arizona again. He lived at Fort Sill until his death in 1909, having become something of a celebrity in his later years. He appeared at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair and rode in President Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade in 1905. He sold photographs, bows and arrows, and other items to curious visitors, always identified as the last Apache warrior. His autobiography, dictated to S.M. Barrett, was published in 1906, providing his own perspective on the Apache Wars, though filtered through translation and editing. Geronimo's celebrity in his final years reflected changing American attitudes toward the Apache and native peoples more broadly. Once seen as savage enemies, the Apache were increasingly viewed through the lens of nostalgia and romanticism, as symbols of a vanishing frontier rather than as living people with continuing concerns and needs. This romanticization was a double-edged sword. It preserved Apache stories and brought some sympathy for Apache causes, but it also tended to relegate the Apache to the past, as if their story ended with Geronimo's surrender. But the Apache story did not end in 1886. While the Apache Wars concluded, Apache people continued to exist, adapt, and maintain their cultural identity despite tremendous pressures to assimilate. The reservation period, which continues to the present day, brought new challenges and required different forms of resistance and resilience. The various Apache reservations, San Carlos and Fort Apache, White Mountain in Arizona, Mescalero in New Mexico, and eventually Fort Sill in Oklahoma, where Geronimo's Chiricahua Band remained until 1913, became the new Apache homelands. Conditions on these reservations varied, but all represented dramatic departures from traditional Apache life. The free-ranging mobility that had characterized Apache existence was restricted to reservation boundaries. Hunting, gathering, and raiding were replaced with farming, wage labor, and dependence on government rations and services. Children were often sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak Apache or practice traditional customs as part of a systematic effort to civilize native peoples by destroying their cultures. The boarding school experience was particularly traumatic for Apache children and families. Beginning in the 1870s and continuing well into the 20th century, Apache children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to boarding schools, sometimes hundreds or thousands of miles away. At schools like the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, the explicit goal was to kill the Indian, save the man, to strip native children of their cultural identity and remake them as Americans. Children had their hair cut, were forbidden to speak their languages, were punished for practicing traditional customs, and were subjected to harsh discipline and sometimes abuse. Many children died far from home, of diseases, harsh treatment, or simple heartbreak. The boarding school system had profound and lasting impacts on Apache families and communities. It disrupted the traditional transmission of knowledge from elders to children. It created generational trauma that still affects Apache communities today. It produced a generation of Apache people who were caught between worlds, no longer fully comfortable with traditional Apache culture, but not fully accepted in white American society either. The legacy of boarding schools is still being reckoned with in Apache communities, where efforts to revitalize Apache languages and cultural practices must overcome the damage done by generations of forced assimilation. Despite these pressures, Apache culture did not disappear. In homes and communities, in ceremonies conducted quietly away from government eyes, Apache people maintained their languages, stories, and traditions. The sunrise dance continued to be performed for Apache girls. Shamans continued to practice traditional medicine. Elders taught children about Apache history and values. This cultural persistence required tremendous courage and dedication, as those who maintained traditional practices faced criticism, pressure, and sometimes punishment from government officials who wanted the Apache to abandon their heritage. Economic conditions on the reservations were generally poor. The land assigned to reservations was often marginal for agriculture, and the Apache, not traditionally farmers, struggled to adapt to sedentary agriculture. Government rations were frequently inadequate, both in quantity and quality. Wage labor opportunities were limited, and when available, often involved working for non-Apache ranchers or businesses at low wages. The Apache found themselves dependent on a government bureaucracy that was often corrupt, incompetent, or actively hostile to Apache interests. In the early 20th century, some positive changes began to occur. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, while controversial and imperfect, ended the allotment policy that had broken up reservation lands and allowed tribes to establish formal governments with constitutions and bylaws. Apache reservations established tribal governments. though the effectiveness and legitimacy of these governments varied and sometimes came into conflict with traditional Apache leadership structures. World War II brought significant changes to Apache communities. Many Apache men served in the U.S. military with distinction, including as code talkers. The Chiricahua and Mescalero Apache dialects were used for secure communications in the Pacific Theater, much like the better-known Navajo code talkers. Apache soldiers served in combat roles throughout the war, fighting in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Military service provided Apache men with opportunities for travel, education, and employment, and their service helped challenge stereotypes about Native Americans. However, returning veterans often found conditions on reservations largely unchanged. The post-war period brought new challenges and opportunities. Some Apache people relocated to cities through the Federal Relocation Program of the 1950s, seeking employment and education. This urban migration created new Apache communities in cities like Phoenix, Los Angeles, and elsewhere. But it also further dispersed Apache populations and made cultural maintenance more difficult. The civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s brought renewed activism to Native American communities, including the Apache. The American Indian Movement, IGAIM, and other activist organizations fought for treaty rights, cultural preservation, and improved conditions on reservations. Apache people participated in these movements, advocating for their rights and working to improve conditions in their communities. This period saw increased emphasis on cultural revitalization, language preservation, and assertion of tribal sovereignty. The passage of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act in 1975 gave tribes greater control over their own affairs, allowing them to contract with the federal government to run programs and services that had previously been managed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Apache tribes took advantage of these opportunities to gain more control over their education systems, health services, and economic development. This shift towards self-determination has continued and expanded in subsequent decades. Economic development has been a major focus for Apache tribes in recent decades. Some Apache communities have developed successful cattle ranching operations, building on the Apache's long history as skilled handlers of livestock. The White Mountain Apache tribe has developed a substantial timber industry, managing forest resources on their reservation. Tourism has become important for many Apache communities, with ski resorts, casinos, and cultural centers providing employment and revenue. The Mescalero Apache tribe has been particularly successful in economic development. They operate the Inn of the Mountain Gods Resort and Casino, a major employer in southern New Mexico. They have also developed a ski resort, hunting and fishing operations, and other enterprises. This economic success has allowed the Mescalero to improve infrastructure, education, and services on their reservation, though challenges remain. Cultural preservation and revitalization have been priorities for Apache communities. Language programs work to teach Apache languages to younger generations, combating the decline in fluent speakers. The sunrise dance and other ceremonies continue to be practiced and have in some cases seen renewed participation. Apache artists maintain traditional crafts like basketry while also working in contemporary media. Museums and cultural centers, often tribally operated, preserve and display Apache history and culture. The White Mountain Apache tribe has developed comprehensive language and cultural programs, including immersion schools, where children learn Apache language and culture. These programs recognize that language is not just a communication tool, but the carrier of cultural knowledge, worldview, and identity. Similar efforts are underway in other Apache communities, though they face challenges including limited funding, the advanced age of many fluent speakers, and competition from English and American popular culture. Apache tribes have also worked to protect sacred sites and cultural resources. Many locations throughout the Southwest hold deep spiritual significance for Apache people: mountains, springs, and other places where ceremonies are conducted or where important events in Apache history or mythology occurred. Apache tribes have fought to prevent development of these sites, seeking federal protection for sacred places and asserting their right to access and use traditional locations, even when they fall outside reservation boundaries. One particularly contentious example involves Mount Graham in southeastern Arizona, sacred to the Western Apache but selected as the site for an astronomical observatory. Despite Apache opposition, the observatory was built, representing a continuing struggle over the use of lands that hold significance for Apache people. Similar conflicts have occurred over mining operations, recreational development, and other projects that affect areas of cultural importance to the Apache. The story of the Apache in the 21st century is one of continuity and change, of maintaining cultural identity while adapting to modern circumstances. Apache communities face many of the same challenges as other rural and Native American communities: limited economic opportunities, health disparities, educational challenges, and social problems. Rates of poverty, unemployment, and certain health conditions remain higher in Apache communities than in the general U.S. population. Substance abuse and suicide, particularly among young people, are serious concerns. Yet alongside these challenges are remarkable resilience and achievement. Apache students attend universities and return to their communities with advanced degrees. Apache veterans continue to serve in the U.S. military at rates higher than the general population. Apache artists, writers, and musicians create works that express Apache identity and experience to wider audiences. Apache tribal governments provide services, create jobs and work to improve conditions for their citizens. The Apache language, while endangered, is still spoken. The number of fluent speakers has declined dramatically, and in some Apache communities, very few young people speak the language fluently. However, concerted efforts are being made to document the language, teach it to new speakers, and use it in daily life. Apache words and phrases are used in ceremonies, in tribal government proceedings, and in educational programs. Some Apache families are raising their children to speak Apache, ensuring that the language will continue into future generations. Apache identity remains strong despite centuries of pressure to assimilate. Apache people define themselves not primarily by what they have lost, but by what they have maintained and what they continue to create. Being Apache today means participating in ceremonies like the Sunrise Dance, speaking or learning the Apache language, maintaining connections to family and community, and carrying forward the values of courage, generosity, respect, and resilience that have always defined Apache culture. The Apache relationship with the land remains central to Apache identity. Even for Apache people who live in cities or off the reservation, the mountains, deserts, and waterways of the Southwest hold deep significance. These are not just locations, but living parts of Apache history and spirituality. Every mountain has stories. Every spring has memories. Every canyon echoes with the voices of ancestors. This connection to place is not nostalgic, but living and immediate, shaping how Apache people understand themselves and their relationship to the world. Looking back over the centuries of Apache history, certain themes emerge. The Apache demonstrated remarkable adaptability, changing their culture and tactics to meet new circumstances while maintaining core values and identity. They showed extraordinary resilience, surviving catastrophic population losses from disease and warfare, forced relocations, cultural suppression, and systematic efforts to destroy their way of life. They exhibited fierce independence, resisting subordination and maintaining autonomy even when the costs were terrible. The Apache also exemplified the tragic pattern of indigenous peoples throughout the Americas: dispossession, warfare, confinement, and cultural suppression, all justified by ideologies of racial superiority and manifest destiny. The Apache Wars were not conflicts between equals, but the violent imposition of American will on a people whose land and freedom were stolen. The suffering inflicted on Apache families, children killed, communities destroyed, survivors imprisoned far from their homeland, was unnecessary and unjust, the product of greed, racism, and imperial ambition rather than inevitable historical forces. Yet to see the Apache only as victims would be to miss essential parts of their story. The Apache were agents in their own history, making choices, fighting for their freedom, and maintaining their dignity even in defeat. Leaders like Mangus Coloradas, Cochise, Victorio, and Geronimo were not simply reacting to American expansion, but pursuing their own goals, protecting their people and defending a way of life they valued. Apache warriors were formidable opponents who made the American conquest of the Southwest costly and difficult. Apache people maintained their culture despite systematic efforts to destroy it, an act of resistance as important as any military campaign. The Apache today continue this tradition of resilience and resistance. They fight not with weapons, but with education, cultural programs, legal advocacy, and economic development. They resist not American rule, they are American citizens and often proud veterans and patriots, but the erasure of Apache identity and the forgetting of Apache history. They work to ensure that Apache languages, stories, and traditions will be passed to future generations. They assert tribal sovereignty and work to improve conditions in their communities. The Apache have also contributed significantly to broader American culture and identity. The image of the Apache warrior has become iconic in American popular culture, though often in ways that simplify or distort Apache reality. Apache place names dot the Southwest, and the Apache name has been given to everything from military helicopters to sports teams. These uses of Apache imagery and names are contested. Some Apache people see them as honoring Apache heritage, while others view them as appropriation that commodifies Apache identity without benefiting Apache communities. More substantially, the Apache have contributed to American history, military science, and understanding of human adaptation to challenging environments. The guerrilla warfare tactics that proved so effective against much larger American and Mexican forces have been studied by military strategists. The Apache's ability to survive and operate in harsh desert and mountain terrain provided lessons in endurance and fieldcraft. The courage and tactical brilliance of Apache warriors earned respect even from their enemies, and that respect, complicated and sometimes romanticized as it is, represents acknowledgement of Apache achievement. As we reach the end of this narrative, it is worth reflecting on what the Apache story means in the broader sweep of human history. It is, fundamentally, a story about the collision of cultures, the costs of conquest, and the resilience of human communities in the face of overwhelming pressures to change or disappear. It is a story about the relationship between people and land, and about what happens when that relationship is disrupted. It is a story about resistance, armed resistance certainly, but also cultural resistance, the determination to remain Apache even when powerful forces work to destroy Apache identity. The Apache experience also raises profound questions about justice, sovereignty, and national identity. The Apache were conquered and confined to reservations, their lands taken, their children removed to boarding schools, their way of life systematically undermined. Yet they never ceded their identity as Apache people, and Apache tribes today maintain a complex political status as domestic dependent nations within the United States, exercising limited sovereignty while remaining subject to federal authority. This arrangement, the product of history and law, continues to evolve as Apache tribes assert greater control over their affairs and work to address historical injustices. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you will carry with you images of the Apache homeland. Vast desert landscapes under endless skies, mountains rising in purple relief against the horizon, hidden canyons where water flows and life persists. Perhaps you will think of Apache warriors moving through this landscape with purposeful grace, their knowledge of the land so complete that they seemed part of it. Perhaps you will think of Apache children learning from their elders, absorbing knowledge that had been accumulated over generations, preparing to carry that knowledge forward. The Apache story is not over. Apache people continue to live, work, love, struggle, and thrive. They continue to speak Apache languages, practice Apache ceremonies, and pass Apache knowledge to their children. They continue to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining connection to their heritage. They continue to be Apache, and in that continuation lies both the legacy of their ancestors and the promise of their future. In the quiet moments before sleep, consider the endurance that the Apache represent. Consider the courage required not just to fight against overwhelming odds, but to maintain identity and dignity in the face of systematic efforts to destroy both. Consider the wisdom of elders who preserved knowledge through dark times, trusting that it would be needed again. Consider the hope of parents who taught their children to be Apache even when the world seemed to demand that they be something else. The Apache survived the conquest of their homeland, the destruction of their traditional way of life, imprisonment, forced assimilation, and systematic cultural suppression. They survived because they were adaptable without being malleable, fierce without being inflexible, and proud without being rigid. They survived because they valued their culture enough to fight for it, and because they loved their children enough to pass that culture forward even when doing so was difficult and dangerous. Tonight, we have talked about the Apache, their origins and culture, their conflicts and leaders, their suffering and survival, their past and their present. We have traced their story from the ancient migrations that brought them to the Southwest, through centuries of freedom, decades of warfare, and generations of adaptation to reservation life. We have seen them at war and at peace, in triumph and in tragedy, fighting for survival and working to preserve their heritage. The Apache homeland is still there, those mountains and deserts that shaped Apache culture and that witnessed Apache history. The reservations where Apache people live today occupy a small fraction of their ancestral territory, but within those boundaries, Apache culture continues. The sunrise dance is still performed under the same sun that watched over Apache ceremonies centuries ago. Apache languages are still spoken, carrying knowledge and worldview across generations. Apache people still gather in family groups, still tell stories, still maintain the connections of kinship and community that have always defined what it means to be Apache. As you close your eyes tonight, carry with you the knowledge that human culture is resilient, that identity can survive even the most determined efforts to destroy it, and that the story of any people is never truly finished as long as their descendants continue to carry it forward. The Apache were not conquered out of existence. They were changed, certainly, and they endured terrible losses. But they remain. They remain as peoples, as communities, as cultures, and as proud inheritors of a heritage that stretches back through time. The desert winds still blow across the Apache homeland, carrying with them the same scents they carried centuries ago. Creosote after rain, Pine from the mountains, dust from the dry places. The stars still wheel overhead in the vast southwestern sky. The same stars that guided Apache travelers through the night. The land endures, and the Apache endure with it, bound to place and to each other by ties that history has tested, but not broken. Rest now, and let the story of the Apache settle in your mind like desert twilight, bringing calm and perspective. Their story, with all its struggle and tragedy, also carries lessons of courage, resilience, and the enduring strength of human communities. The Apache faced the sunset of their traditional way of life with their eyes open and their dignity intact, and they have walked into a new dawn carrying their heritage with them. That is no small achievement. That is worthy of respect, of remembrance, and of the quiet contemplation that comes in the moments before sleep. The Apache were warriors, yes, but they were also parents and children, hunters and gatherers, storytellers and shamans, people who loved and feared and hoped and endured. Their story is human in all its complexity, neither simply heroic nor simply tragic, but real, and in its reality, instructive for all who take the time to listen. Good night, and may you rest in peace, carrying with you the knowledge that the Apache story continues, that their culture persists, and that the warriors of the Southwest, though no longer ranging freely across their homeland, remain Apache still, proud inheritors of a heritage that time has tested but not destroyed.